Welcome to CoinShares Features. Today we are in Zug, Switzerland, one of the most crypto-friendly cities in the world, with many foundations based around there, such as Near Foundation, Parity, or Tezos. But today we are meeting Lily Liu. She's going to talk about the future developments of the network and why we should care about Solana. But before, let's go inside. It's freezing out there. Hi Lily. Thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to be with you here in Zug. Before diving into Solana specifics, could you share with us what brought you into blockchain ecosystem and the cryptocurrency space? You've been a long time visage and face of blockchain, first with Earn.com, and now you're also a board member of Ledger. So please tell us.
Right. Well, I started my career in finance. And so I started off in banking, in consulting, in private equity. So I joke at one point I had real jobs and learned a lot, had a fantastic experience. And after that, I did my first, you could call it kind of like startup experience. I was building hospitals in China, which was a very entrepreneurial situation. And then I heard about Bitcoin in 2013. Like many people, I think the first time you heard about Bitcoin and hear about crypto, it's typically on some sort of big speculative wave, up or down or something like that. So I was class of 2013, you could say. And back then it was just Bitcoin. And it was, I think there was Bitcoin, there was Litecoin. I think Ripple had just started. So it was pretty early days. And there was no native smart contracts. There was no Ethereum even yet. That started in 2015. So like many people, I was kind of curious about this. Is just some sort of, money laundering scam or is there something real to it? When I read the white paper, I thought, okay, this is very profound. And it took me a number of years to really sort of characterize it, why it resonated so deeply with me, right? As a finance person, as someone who comes from a traditional industries background, professional services and all the rest, investing background. And what I thought was so interesting about it is, in the discourse around political economy that we have today, the discourse volleys between, a model of corporate ownership and then a model of sort of government ownership over assets, right? Over the factors of production. And there's, financial capital, human capital, we call that capital and labor, right? If we go back to some of the very popular framings historically. And that is the vast majority of the discourse that we have, right? We saw that in numerous historical events over the last 100 years. There's the whole sort of the East versus the West. There was communism versus capitalism, right? There was
the North against the South,
right? The North against the whole Cold War. It's been this ongoing sort of is a capitalist or they call it communism, but really government ownership model. Which one is better for whom? Under what circumstances? Which one is the better model? And I think. We have a very strong perspective as to, I think, empiric perspective on which one is better of those two. But what Bitcoin gave us is this idea that there's like kind of this additional part of the spectrum that has never been discussed because it was never possible to even create that or to scale that, right? Which is a different end of the ownership spectrum, which is around community ownership and individual ownership in a digital world. And of course, our world is increasingly sort of primarily digital rather than physical. So now there's sort of the ability for individual ownership to scale very dramatically over the scale of the internet, whereas for most of human time, your physical ownership was sort of limited to the confines of where you could actually physically transport those assets, how you could physically transport the gold or the house that you lived in and who you could physically trade with, which was kind of limited by the physical distances, right, before you had a digital world. And so what was so interesting to me is it really just opened up this, is it even possible to have a system that has sort of stronger elements of individual and community ownership to complement the discourse we've always been focused on, which is corporate versus government ownership. That's what was really interesting about it to me from the very beginning, from a longer arc. Now, of course, on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis, then how do you operationalize that? Okay, well, those are all the things that we pay attention to any given point in time. This trend, that trend. What are the technological trends? What are the consumer trends? But that to me is kind of the overarching reason why we're here.
And what brought you into Solana specifically?
Yeah, well, so as you mentioned, I did Earn.com, and I started off with Bitcoin in exchange and then mining. We turned that into Earn.com, sold that to Coinbase in 2018, and then was spent a couple of years advising, doing investing, sort of getting involved in a number of different things. And in 2021, I started using Solana DeFi. And, every so often just kind of check out what's new and what's going on. And I'd also spent quite a period of time being very focused on Bitcoin. But I thought that this whole vision of Bitcoin actually extends beyond the Bitcoin protocol itself, right? There's the Bitcoin protocol, and then there's kind of like the broader aspirational movement that Bitcoin introduced and advanced. And that is that cryptography gives you freedom in a digital world, right? And that's the bigger idea that Bitcoin introduced for blockchains. So when I thought about it that way, I thought, okay, well, maybe we think about there's the Bitcoin technology itself, and then there's the movement that Bitcoin spawned. And that's not just about sound money. It's not just about store of value, right? It's, of course, very important to have that. And Bitcoin does a phenomenal job at that, because there's the two calls to action for Bitcoin always are, number one, buy, number two, do nothing, right? But then the subsequent vision of, okay, well, how can you build this sort of how could you build, architect, and proliferate this global financial system that everyone can use, right? That's accessible to anyone that has access to the internet. And that kind of broader vision around a global financial system, people have also described that as programmable money. The term that we like to use for it is how do you build these internet capital markets? So when I thought, okay, well, who's going to be able to build that? Okay, well, there's got to be a couple of features of, let's call it the community and the technology. It's got to be performant. You've got to have native smart contracts. You have to be able to kind of have that cultural element that we all kind of like know when we see it within crypto, to be able to build a developer community, because open source without a community of developers and builders is not worth all that much, right? That is the real value of open source. So when I looked around, I thought, well, actually, I think Solana is probably the one that can deliver on that. That was in 2021. So that's what attracted me to Solana back in 2021. And that's still what keeps me going.
And as you said, Solana is basically 5 years old. Could you remind us why it has been invented in the first place?
Yeah. Well, Anatoly Yakovenko, he came up with this idea in, I think, 2017, 2018. And so if we remember back then, there was the whole ICO boom. And that was like this huge kind of speculative fervor. But, behind any speculative fervor, there's always kind of this grain of, there's a primitive of something that can be very powerful in the future, right? But then during that time, I think it originally started in December 2017 with CryptoKitties. This one application essentially kind of like broke Ethereum, if you will, right? Way back then. It became pretty apparent to pretty much everyone that scaling is going to be scaling the technology to match the very large aspirations of this space was going to take quite a bit of work. So there were a whole bunch of folks in 2017, 2018 that proposed various different architectures to be able to provide in a sort of bona fide decentralized network greater performance, right? To be able to handle the anticipated demand for block space. And so there's many different efforts at that. Solana's one. And I think what was distinct about Solana from the beginning was it's fairly heretical. It still is considered heretical by a number of people, that you would not immediately go to some form of sharding L2s, but sort of asynchronous execution, but instead try to focus everything on having a parallelized synchronous execution environment. So that was the vision. And I think that there's endless conversations that people have had around on the technical front, right, on the community front, on scalability front, truly endless discussion. But I think one of the early perspectives that is still pretty emblematic of what I think makes Solana a special integrated community is that there's always been this view that this technology should support products that are 10x useful for people to use. And the technology is really just kind of a base layer for application developers. It's an infrastructure layer for application developers to build products for users. And I think that is a worldview that is very intuitive to us within Solana, because I honestly never really considered that it would be anything but. However, it's become more clear to me when I look at other ecosystems that there's actually a lot of folks who are still stuck on building infrastructure for infrastructure. And applications, products, and users are a little bit of an afterthought, maybe because the industry has spent so many years building infrastructure for infrastructure, and it's been very successful in the past, financially at least. The inertia of thinking, well, it worked in 2017, 2018, that cycle worked in 2020 and 2021, so it must work again if it's a different version of infrastructure. So I think One of the differentiators, therefore, is we've always had this worldview that it's infrastructure for applications, for products, for users, and that's always been the point, right? So therefore, when you look at some of the architectural trade-offs that Solana made from the very, very early days, it was, well, at the network level, maybe we should make a bit of a ecosystem level trade-off that in order to eventually be able to deliver a better experience to application developers, to products and users, then we can shift more of the burden, therefore the cost, and complexity of running a validator on the validator network. It's not 10x more complicated. It's probably 2 or 3x more expensive, at least from kind of like a bare metal perspective. But that's a worthwhile trade-off from an overall kind of integrated, if you look at blockchain as an integrated economy, that's a trade-off that makes sense for the integrated economy.
Since its inception, and speaking of trade-off, Solana has been criticized for its lack of decentralization. So how have you managed to improve this area?
Well, I think that critique is just kind of factually untrue these days. That critique, I've been hearing that one for a really long time now. I was hearing that from 2020 and in 2021. And I think that in 2020 and 2021, within 1 year after mainnet launched, of course it was true, right? I think any sort of blockchain 12 months from mainnet launch is going to be in earlier stages of building a validator network. But what's happened now is we've reached so many different degrees of sort of advancement, maturity, innovation at the network level. But for some reason, and I think that there's just a lot of people who want to believe that Solana still is very centralized, and they're literally echoing a narrative from 2020, right? But if you actually look at the facts, and we've thought about network decentralization across a number of different factors. I think that, so the network is about 2,000 nodes today, and they're distributed around the world. We look at not just node count, right? But you look at the Nakamoto coefficient, so how many validators control 33% of the stake, the supermajority, and or superminority, I suppose. And so we look at, certainly those metrics are very high level, but then we also look at ASN diversity. You want to make sure that there aren't 100 nodes, then 50 of them are run by Hetzner and 50 of them are being run in AWS. But then do you have geographic diversity, and do you have diversity across, and they're not just all sort of cloud service providers as well, but there's actually a number of nodes being run independently on bare metal. And those are the types of things that really matter long-term over, as you really think about sort of operationalizing network growth, network health, and network diversity over time, that are not going to be reflected in just simply node count, right? And so I think that the critique that I feel like I still hear about Solana being centralized, first of all, is based off of 4-year-old information. And second of all, oftentimes being advanced by folks that haven't spent any time in the Solana ecosystem within basically the last 4 years, right? So it's just factually not really true.
Still, it's pretty expensive to run a node on Solana. Don't you think there's something that could be improved there?
Well, it is a higher hardware spec, that's true. But then in terms of sort of base cost to run a validator every month, you're talking about $700-800 for a Solana validator, versus if you're running a Tendermint validator, it's about $300. So we're talking about a few $100s a month, practically.
So according to you, how Solana competes with other blockchains in terms of technology?
I think if you look around, then there are no other blockchains that have both the performance as well as the community, and also roadmap for improving the network really substantially over time. Improving the network is not just about TPS, right? That, like node count, is a very, very high level metric, which matters, but it doesn't tell you the whole story, right? The way that we look at metrics thus far in the industry is we focus on a couple of things: node count, TVL, right? And these things are, of course, they're important. They're part of the story, but they actually leave a good bit about how you actually build a robust industry out of kind of the broader discussion. So I think that, first of all, competition is great. Competition is what makes everyone better. We seek to build the best infrastructure for builders to then build the best ecosystem for capital. We want to be the best place for capital. And so as we look around, we think, okay, well, what are some of the innovations that other folks have been able to advance, and how can we actually improve the Solana, either the chain itself or the tooling on top of that, to improve the experience for validators, for developers, and also folks who are deploying capital. That's something which is very much top of mind for us. So at the network level, TPS is something that, if you have demand for your block space, which we do, I think that it was the end of last year that we became became the #1 chain in terms of real economic value capture, and then also #1 application revenue, and also the fastest growing developer ecosystem, right? So those are all sort of very positive metrics. And in that realm, then, part of the Solana kind of ethos from the very beginning has also been that the network is going to continue to get better. That, as well as this idea that you would have parallel execution and try to keep everything to the greatest extent possible on one shard, was considered heretical at the time, because so much of the discourse from the very beginning was focused on building sound money and store of value, and therefore thinking, well, network improvement is not necessarily a top priority, right? But if you think about this from the perspective of, okay, if one use case of a blockchain is store of value, and that is what sound money, that's what Bitcoin is, but then another way to use this blockchain is to build this kind of technology platform, well, then the required pace of innovation and improvement is just different in those two use cases, and they're complementary. So within Solana, it's actually the harder job to do, rather than, if you get to be Bitcoin, then there's value in not doing all that much, right? Or moving very slowly. Whereas the opposite is true of someone like Solana. You have to constantly be innovating, and if you have demand for your block space, then you have to be ahead of that in terms of technology development in order to continue to supply that demand of block space. We're lucky enough to have a lot of demand for our block space, so that's why we've been making huge investments into something like FireDancer. So second core client, right? We've been making a lot of investments into Onza as well, and the introduction of Agave. And now a big thing that's going to happen here in 2025 is the integration of those into mainnet. And so that's going to be a big challenge for our network.
You recently said on a podcast hosted by Laura Shin that Base couldn't compete with Solana. Are you doubling down on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's always been my long-held position. Now, I think that to provide a more sort of nuanced view about that, the reason why I think that is going back to this whole concept of the spectrum of ownership, right? I think that the beating heart of Bitcoin, blockchain, and crypto from the beginning has been exploring this end of the spectrum, articulating, exploring, and instantiating this end of the spectrum around individual and community ownership. Of course, have a lot of respect for the people who are building really anything in this ecosystem. It's really hard. So, sort of the social media fireworks aside, the specific point I'm making is that a chain like Base, first of all, it's an L2, right? Its stated mission is to scale Ethereum. So we're not even talking about sort of the same, this is apples and oranges to begin with. But then even within that, Base is something that it's obviously, ultimately corporate owned. And there's nothing wrong with that, just pointing that out, right? And by pointing that out, right, what happens in a corporate ownership environment? Well, the future development of Base as a network is going to be strongly influenced by its stakeholders, and who are its stakeholders. And so I don't mean this in a critical way necessarily, I'm just pointing out the obvious, which is that Coinbase's L2 called Base has a strong corporate aspect to it. There's nothing controversial about that comment, right? And when you think about its positioning, therefore, on the longer arc of how blockchain is going to develop, well, it's just not going to be in that end of the spectrum, which is about community and individual ownership in the same proportion. That's all, right? So first of all, it's apples and oranges because we're talking about L1s versus L2s. And second of all, we're talking about a product, which I think they've done an excellent job on, but has a different set of stakeholders.
And what kind of metrics do you look at to measure like Solana's growth?
Yeah. Some of the metrics we talked about earlier, we talk about real economic value. So I think, first of all, a blockchain ecosystem has kind of like multiple sub-components to it. There's the validator ecosystem. The validator ecosystem has to be profitable, right? Otherwise, people are not going to run validators. Right now, you don't hear a lot of people complaining about the cost of running, the bare metal cost of running a Solana validator. Okay, with that part of the ecosystem, we look at real economic value. And we don't really look at, I think, sometimes people will talk about active addresses or active users. To me, that's a bit too much of a sort of skeuomorphic holdover from the Web 2 world. Because if you just look at the way blockchains are architected, just given the way token accounts work within Solana, you'll have more active addresses than equivalent activity on Ethereum, right? So I think those metrics people have used in the past, I think we need different metrics as an industry just because blockchains are architected differently. Okay, so real economic value, I think, is one that can measure kind of validator economics, right? If your validators are profitable, then over time you will have a much more sustainable network. And then I think at the application layer, you can look at fee payers, right? You can also look at application revenue. And so that just means, if someone took a risk on your ecosystem, built an application, are they making money? They've got to make money. If they're not making money, they're going to go to something else, right? There's nothing surprising about that. Those are the ones that we really focus on kind of near term in terms of one of the subsystems, which is around validator economy, and then the other one around kind of the application builder economy, because those are kind of two of the most important building blocks to make sure you have a really strong basis and then you can basically build a network effect on both of those going forward.
I would like to address the token holders. Solana can sometimes be criticized for its inflation. Do you think that it's a challenge to bring value to token holders?
Yeah, I mean, inflation is programmatically decreasing over time. And I think this is an interesting point of discussion as well, because going back to kind of the different kind of like sub-economies within a blockchain ecosystem, right? There's we talked about the validator network, the application builders, and then there's also the token holders. And there's maybe a couple. Let's just talk about those three for a second. So in a healthy ecosystem, you want all three of these to be robust and making money. Right? Now, that said, because they are integrated economies, there will be times when you have to think about trade-offs, right? In the same way that the network architecture of Solana from the very beginning made some trade-offs of putting more of the burden of running a sort of more infrastructure-heavy network on validators than users, because, okay, well, if the validators take a little bit more of that burden, then it will make a better experience for users, and collectively, over the long term, everyone is going to win from that, right? Because, if your users don't want to use it, you're not going to have block space anyways, and so, the economics might not sort of be optimized over time anyhow. Okay. And so with the token holders then, yes, there's more inflation, but then what I think is interesting, actually, I think that this is, from my perspective, kind of seen within CoinShares, is when it comes to let's not just say token holders, but kind of the capital markets aspect of crypto, which is very substantial, right? You've got the validators, you've got the application builders, and then you've got what's called the developers, and then you've got the investors. And I think that, investors, we could talk about this at length as well, sort of different perspectives on how investors have started to see crypto over time. But there's some part of the investor ecosystem that looks at crypto as an emergent asset class, and then thinks about sort of investing from an illiquid and then a liquid perspective into crypto. And I think a number of people see that inflation as yield, right? And that's actually very attractive to a number of capital deployers. Now, one can critique that as being, okay, well, that's too simplistic with nominal view on yield, right? You have to look at that over a broader period of time. But I will say that there's been a tremendous amount of interest in liquid staking in Solana. And there's been a tremendous amount of interest in sort of building new capital products within the Solana ecosystem, aided by the fact that it's not just that it's performant and that there's critical mass of developers, but also when you have this inflation and all the kind of and then all of the additional economic opportunity at the validator level that comes with JITO bundles, right, with MEV and with other sort of validator optimizations, that there's actually this bucket of yield there that becomes very interesting from a capital markets perspective, from a financial products, let's call it structured products perspective. It is true that creates dilution over time, which is greater certainly at 8% than it is at 3%, right? But I think that there's also a growth contribution that it makes to the ecosystem because it attracts people who innovate in terms of financial products.
A lot of TradFi institutions coming into Solana, like BlackRock, Securitize, French bank Société Générale with its stablecoin. What does it tell about Solana?
Well, I think that, going back to the original vision of blockchain, right, that Bitcoin gave us, it's this idea that you would have globally accessible financial infrastructure. So rather than today, where it's all, our financial systems are all based on analog technology because, we've been using them since way before the internet, then you would have, in the same way that 5 billion people can access the internet, if you can access the internet, then you could access some form of financial infrastructure. That's kind of been the base vision of crypto from the beginning, right? Internet of finance, digital money, digitally native, so where money becomes data. So there's many ways that people have talked about this in the past. And so therefore, I think that the potential scope of internet capital markets is definitionally broader than what we define as being financial markets today, right? Because all of those assets that we recognize as being financial assets today, from fiat money, money market funds, various forms of different funds, securities, debt instruments. Increasingly, what we're seeing, especially in this cycle now, this has also been articulated for at least 10 years, is the ability to issue those assets on a blockchain. And if it is some form of a public blockchain, then you have access potentially to the liquidity of 5 billion people in the same way that you have the liquidity of potential consumers, 5 billion consumers, if you're on the open internet. That's probably most seen in search engines and social media platforms, right? So I think that is the potential of what blockchain can do, and having sort of open finance. So where I think institutions come into that is, clearly the financial markets are primarily in, the financial industry today, but then those assets can have the potential of all being represented on-chain and being accessible to some portion of those 5 billion users. That's kind of like the grand vision. And so I think it's great that some of the best, brightest, and most respected institutions are seeing that potential and seeing this as being complementary to their business in the same way that 30 years ago, when the internet, you call it Internet 1.0 or 2.0, or Web 1 and Web 2 introduced this idea that you would have default open information. It doesn't mean that all information, certainly does not mean that all information is accessible to everyone all of the time. We have tons of permissioning in the Web 2 world, right? But the infrastructure is open, and that allows sort of global scalability to today 5 billion people and probably more in the future. So therefore, I think that with open finance, these institutions, which are the issuers and sort of the guardians of the majority of assets today on Wall Street and in kind of traditional finance, are a really necessary player in terms of bringing those assets on chain and helping us build this broader vision of open finance. Because open finance is going to be agnostic to which assets, in the same way that the information internet is pretty agnostic as to whether it's an email or whether it's Elon Musk's social media post, right? In a way, those are all somewhat neutral in that they're all just bits of data, and they both exist in, probably, not just probably, certainly other forms of data, let's call it, or content that may not want to see, right? So there's going to be the full range of content. Not all content is going to be for everyone, because that's what it means to be open finance. In the same way, that's what we have on the open internet.
Speaking of that, tell us more about finance and how it's going to improve, like the Solana network and the ecosystem.
So FireDancer, in a pure FireDancer environment, with about 100 nodes running, they've been able to get to 1 million TPS. That's pretty cool. To my knowledge, there aren't other live blockchain clients that are able to deliver on that degree of performance, right? Now, running mainnet, where you have to integrate Agave and FireDancer, then that's additional kind of level of work, right? So I don't know that mainnet in 2025 is going to be reflecting that performance that you get on a pure FireDancer only 100 nodes type of environment. But what we do have is all of the other things that are not just TPS that make blockchains valuable, right? Blockchains that are just around TPS and don't have the whole builder network ecosystem around it. Well, again, open source actually is not worth, it's just a GitHub repo. And what actually imbues these open source communities with value is the talent, is the builders, the contributors, and that kind of, and all of the things that people are building on top of that technology that complement and compound with one another.
In terms of payment, I can remember seeing Solana Pay in action during a French conference. Do you think that Solana has a role to play in the payment solutions and ecosystem?
I think with an on-chain economy, you have to have speculative or trading types of use cases complemented by more transactional use cases. If you look at an economy, there's no economy which is purely just speculation, really just purely transactional, just kind of payments to trading. Any economy integrates these different uses of money because ultimately, here's money and here's all the ways that people want to use it. They want to pay, they want to save, and they want to invest. And one of the things that we get with digital finance, with open finance, and with programmable money is this idea that you can start to collapse these functions down together, right? So I've got a wallet. Through self-custody, I have a wallet, and I have, stable coins in my wallet, and you kind of break down these the segmentations that we kind of have inherited in the more traditional world where, as I remember being in the US, for example, I would have Venmo for payments, and then I would have, let's call it Wells Fargo, if I had a little bit more money for savings. And then if you had more money to invest, then I would have a Charles Schwab brokerage account, for example, right? And those are three totally different experiences, highly walled off from one another, actually pretty hard to move money between them. Whereas if you have a self-custody wallet with stablecoins, then you can pay and you can save and invest in even just one fluid motion, right? So those are some of the new consumer experiences when it comes to using money that I think are unique. And when I think about it, I don't know, why should it be the current way where you have three very separate experiences? Why shouldn't it be kind of more integrated? And so therefore, payments, I think, is inherently a part of just the way people use money anyways. And people want a more integrated experience. Where you've seen people have a more integrated experience is, I think the closest corollary we have is probably the super apps that you have in Asia, from WeChat to increasingly Grab, right? And those have been phenomenal, right? Those are actually kind of like the envy of the Western tech world as well. And so, we have a bit of a precedence that people actually really like this, right? So integrating financial experiences with consumption. And then, so that's where they started, payments with consumption of things that you consume all the time, like rides, and then consuming other things like food, right? Delivery. And then the introduction of financing products on top of that. So you've got a cash balance. Okay, well, why don't you put that into an asset management product? So we've already seen how people like that integrated approach. And what crypto does is provides the potential to build that experience really as default everywhere. Because with stablecoins, stablecoins and self-custody, you essentially have the ability to build fintech native experiences today, right? So I think that's pretty cool. And so Solana Pay, which was built about 3 years ago, was one of the first primitives to specifically with regards to merchant payments, right? To allow merchants to use crypto rails to accept payments. And so that is one part of a broader perspective we have on why crypto is important for payments. I think that over the last 3 years as an industry, we've matured in a couple of ways. And I think now I'm super excited about what we can do with stablecoins and payments and programmable payments. We call it PayFi. PayFi being this broader vertical in this category, which is not just sort of merchant payments, but beyond that, how do you create these new payments-based primitives that start to take payments, savings, and investments and create more integrated experiences? And so I think that is hugely exciting, right? It's not just about moving money from me to you or me to a merchant and be like, oh, it's faster, cheaper, and 24/7. I think that is good. I think it's just not good enough in crypto to really substantiate the value proposition of this technology. I think you have to have sort of 10x use cases that are uniquely valuable, right? So in the way that with Web 2, it wasn't just about digitizing the newspaper, although that happened as well. That was also fast, cheap, and constant, right? And that reminds me a little bit of the narrative that people will typically focus on when it comes to stablecoins, that stablecoins, fast, cheap, and constant. 24/7 settlement, you don't have to wait for SWIFT during US or Eastern time working hours, or your correspondent bank where you kind of throw a wire into the ether and kind of gets there. You don't know who it went to, when, and where, right? You just kind of like call every day for a couple of days, depending on where you're sending it to. And so that's good, but I think it's really about creating these value-added primitives that create basically these integrated fintech experiences that allow anyone, anywhere to spend money, save money, so earn money, spend money, save money, and then also sort of grow their assets over time.
On another topic, we've seen like Solana being a major player, really a major player in DePin with applications such as Ranger or Helium. How do you explain that place that Solana has?
Well, I think that it comes down to many of the elements are the same over and over again, right? It's a performant technology with robust ecosystem of builders and that are really focused on building useful products. And that gets expressed in so many different ways. And with DePin, so DePin, I think it was about a year and a half ago. Well, we've known the Helium team for quite a while. They were a darling of the last cycle, 21, 22, right? And they've been very high conviction, building amazing things for a long time. And they came to Solana recognizing that they would build a better product if they focused on the product rather than trying to build the blockchain alongside, right? Because if you build your own blockchain, then there's a lot of things that come with building your own blockchain. So you've got to not just build the tech, you have to build a community, you have to attract a community of builders to use your tech. And I think that this is a decision that many folks are coming to when they think about application-specific blockchain or not, right? They kind of realize that building, maintaining, and curating, and really helping a validator network thrive is actually a whole lot of work, right? And it might actually be a better use of that team's time to really focus on building an incredible product, and that's the trade-off that Helium has made. And so Helium, their token is on Solana, and they are, and what you see now is they're building some pretty cool stuff, right? They're building an MVNO in the US, and I believe, don't quote me on this, Abe, but that's Abe for the latest. But about 20% of that is currently being sourced, 20% of that capacity is being sourced from Helium nodes. And eventually it's going to be more, right? But that's pretty powerful. And that is, again, community ownership and then individual ownership to complement the corporate and then kind of the, just broadening the spectrum of ownership. So I think that is they were kind of the first DePin project to come over and really lay stake in Solana. So we will always embrace Helium for that. But then I think why are other DePin projects coming? Well, it starts off with, if I want to have a DePin token, then it's got to be somewhere which is performant, right? If I want to be able to have, my aspiration as a DePin founder is to have thousands of nodes, right? I want those thousands of nodes to have a secure network that is performant and also already kind of has built-in ecosystem of builders and users. And when you add all of that together, it's really not a huge set right now.
Lily, we have to talk about Memecoins. And the meme coin culture in Solana. Do you think that it's important for Solana to distance itself from this kind of culture, from platforms such as Pump.fun and stuff like that? Or do you think it's part of the Solana culture and we have to embrace that?
Well, I mean, should the internet distance itself from OnlyFans?
I don't know. Tell me.
Well, first of all, who is the internet, right? Now, certain people within the internet distance, embrace, whatever, there's full spectrum of different opinions, and that's what it means to be an open platform. I think that going back to what we were saying earlier, where open finance is going to have a whole range of different assets, and not everyone is going to like all of that content on the financial internet, right? In the same way that there's a whole lot of content on the information internet that a lot of people do not like, and it is a daily, constant point of debate, right? In small ways and in large ways. Of course, that's going to exist in any open system, right? Because everything is on day one out in the open and open for discussion and open for all of the emotions and all of the feelings. And so Memecoins, I think they are on that spectrum of kind of different financial content. And so we have the full spectrum. There's going to be the spectrum, which the one end of the spectrum, which is going to be money market funds from some of our most respected institutions. And then at the other end of the spectrum is going to be meme coins that people have mixed opinions on. And that's just, I expect that in an open system. We as the foundation certainly have no control over it, right? We as the broader ecosystem have a diversity of different opinions, and that's just the way it's going to be, in the same way that we have quite a variety of opinions as to posts on Twitter, posts on Facebook, certain applications that exist on the internet that, you may or may not like, and that's just what it means to be an open system.
I would like to take a step back because Solana has experienced like one of the most credible comeback since FTX. How do you explain that Solana bounced in such a good way?
I feel like I've been asked this many times, and oftentimes people say like there must have been some sort of phenomenal story about that. And the truth is, it's both a good story, but it's also a really boring story. People are typically asking that question in reference to what happened in November of 2022, right? So 2021 was this huge arc for Solana, reached all-time high, probably around $250. And then there was a low in the end of 2022 after the FTX collapse. And so I think Solana went down to at one point $8 or $9. And so a lot of people left Solana for dead. Certain roadkill, right? But being within the community and living through that arc from the top and the bottom, what never really changed is no one left, and everyone was building when it was at the all-time high, and everyone was building when it was the all-time low. Yes, there was more stress, right? The emotions were a little bit different, but no one left. And no one ever even had the intent to leave. So from that perspective, it felt actually very consistent. And we all just kind of thought, okay, well, it's time to rebuild. And if we could if we could bring the ecosystem to where it was in 2021, then certainly we can do that again, because really what creates value in a blockchain ecosystem over time is your tech keeps on getting better, and you can attract the best and the brightest to be building cool applications.
In the end, you think that it made Solana stronger?
Yeah, I think so. And so we kind of talk about those crucible moments, right? When you're kind of tested by fire, and if you stay, then you're sort of like hardened into like diamond type of material. It's like kind of you feel indestructible. And so when you make that commitment in November of 2022, I think it just really tests the character of individuals and then of a community. I will say that it was very dramatic at the time, but really, and this really speaks to the character of so many people in Solana. Actually, a lot of people were excited in that moment, right? Excited now, certainly not about the immediate sort of fallout from it, but excited that there was an opportunity to build new things. And so I think that that is really just a character and a cultural thing. Anyone that's faced with a moment of crisis, some people will fold and some people will double down.
I would like to talk more about the role of Solana Foundation. How do you actively engage and help the Solana ecosystem?
The role of a foundation it's kind of like a unique thing in crypto. It doesn't really exist elsewhere. First of all, it's just a legal entity, but then what do you do with that legal entity, and what is the role of foundation? Something we talk about a lot. And I think that the most classic role of a foundation is to fund the development of public goods. Okay, so the most critical public good that we have is validator clients, because there's no blockchain, there's nothing for developers to do, right? We all go home. So that's the most important thing, and that's I think indisputable and very literally kind of the most important thing that we can invest in, right? Invest in network health and then also network tooling to make building on Solana better, more efficient, faster, more delightful for developers. And but then beyond that, how do you build? There's also sort of community public goods in terms of attracting talent and attracting capital. And so we invest in as is broadly defined public goods to really support the ecosystem. Now, there's a number of things that we don't want to do. Such as we don't want to be building products ourselves that are for profit. That's not for us to do. We also we want to push as much as we can to private industry and private capital. So when it comes to investing in projects that are building on Solana, our preference is always that private capital make those investments, because that also builds the capital allocator and the capital formation ecosystem, which over the long run, you want to have a robust capital formation capability. And so anything which comes to sort of being for profit, our strong preference is for that to be taken on by someone in the community. And so, going back to this a broader definition of public goods, I see the development of robust private industry over the time, whether it be capital formation, whether it be dev shops, right, to sort of partner with folks on building the technical side of building a product, right? There's all these different parts of kind of this economy that you want to have built over time. I think the closest corollary to the way we think about it is not actually companies. It's not actually how people built Google or Uber or Facebook. I think the better corollaries, and actually where we've taken more inspiration from, is how Singapore built itself over time, how the UAE has been building itself over time into a very robust economy, and how are the ways that we can help support. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, right? But how can we help stimulate the emergence of really critical sectors and industries that help make the Solana economy, if you will, kind of the Solana city-state, the digital city-state, which is Solana, or to borrow a phrase from biology, the network state, which is Solana. How can we, as the foundation, help make that more robust over time and make long-term investments in that?
So how do you foresee now the Solana's growth in the next future?
So I think that in 2025, it's really about It's always been about building open finance. And I think that the original vision Bitcoin laid out is, actually before kind of 2017 and the conclusion of the block size debate, for the prior kind of almost 10 years, there's a lot of discussion with regards to the broader aspirations of self-custody enabled open financial systems, right? And what they would be. So there's a lot of discourse around, okay, well, is this about store of value, a technology platform, a medium of exchange? And the Bitcoin, the blockchain itself has gone after store of value. Okay. So then in my mind, everyone outside of Bitcoin is building the rest of it. Technology platform, medium of exchange to enable open finance and internet capital markets. That has always been the vision. And I think that's always been the vision for everyone else. And that, therefore, that is the part of the mission that Solana is here to try to fulfill and also try to kind of earn a right to be that platform. And so when I think about how far we've come over the last 5 years, I think it's still quite early because there's a bit of an order of operations for how you have to build this over time. You have to build, obviously, the blockchain network first. There's no network. There's nothing for anyone to do. Then you have to build a talent ecosystem, developer ecosystem, a builder and a founder ecosystem. And so I think and now I think we're kind of at the next phase to really capture what I think is a third network effect, right? So I think the network effects is one, there's a network effect around the network itself. And then I think there has to be a network effect around talent, developers, founders, and builders. And then I think the third network effect is really attracting capital into the Solana-based internet capital market, right? I think of Solana as being global financial infrastructure. And so I think that is really what the whole purpose of blockchain has been from the very beginning. I think that is a part of this kind of broader vision and movement that Bitcoin created, that Solana is here to try to earn a place in. And I think that now where we are about, 5 years after mainnet launch, it's, you're never done with the first two network effects around the network and around talent. But now I think we really need to focus on building sort of the capital markets capability and presence of Solana. And if going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of city development-like analogies, that actually mirrors quite a bit with how people build cities, right? They first built the infrastructure, roads, ports, that type of thing, try to attract the best talent. And what you also notice is being in common between all of these very vibrant city-states that have sort of that project their capital markets capability regionally and then globally. Well, they attract talent, then also try to attract businesses. And I think that's the better analogy for what the various blockchain ecosystems are doing out there. So, yep.
Lily, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.